thank you very much for doing this. And I know I've spoken at a few conferences, and I think you've been there.
Yes, yes. I don't know if I actually got to shake your hand, but I remember you walking right past me at dinner one night and thinking, I gotta go say hello to him.
Well, I'm glad. If not, I'm glad we got to at least talk virtually. So and yeah, I know you kind of touched on this, but just for the sake of this recording, can you just sort of briefly touch on your background? I know you deal a lot with addiction, food addiction particularly, but can you just give us a little quick background?
Yeah, I grew up, I'm the daughter of a biochemist, corporate executive and research development. I went to Oberlin College. I earned an undergraduate degree in economics and political science. I worked for 2 years for a state legislature as a fiscal analyst and decided I really wanted to be in business. I went to the Stanford Business School, got my degree in international finance, and went to work for a Fortune 200 corporation for 5 years. I had my 2 little girls, and I was too sick to go back into the corporate world. I had them 2 years in a row. Lots of allergies and fatigue and brain fog and constant sneezing and runny eyes. I could not go back to work. So I was yo-yo dieting, and I got to a point where I couldn't do that anymore. I was in a group for miserable personalities. I was raised by 2 ragers, and I was raging, and I didn't want to be. So I did all the things. I did personal therapy. I did a women's healing group, a lot of training with these places. And then I landed in a codependence group. And in that group, another member of the group heard the sugar driving my raging. And so she very respectfully, a couple of times that year, said, why don't you try Food Addicts in Recovery? And like, I was in a thin phase, so I'm like, why are you telling me that? But she persisted, and at the end of the year, I knew I couldn't do that low-calorie dieting anymore, and I got the book on how to give up sugars and flours. And 3 weeks into that, I thought, wow, this could never work. That's a lot of food. But I was losing 2 pounds a week. The allergies were lifting, the brain fog was lifting, the fatigue was lifting, just from the sugars and flours, just from giving up the sugars and flours. And then in the 3rd week, I'm standing there in my kitchen in Houston, Texas, and I'm thinking, wow, I haven't had to yell at anybody in 3 weeks. Nobody's done anything that I really needed to get in there and get corrected in 3 weeks. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks that it was about the food. Fortunately, there was a good support group in Houston. I had to wait till Saturday. It was 1996. We didn't have the internet. And sure enough, I went there, and finally I got to ask my question, do people get less irritable on this food plan? And like, there are 20 people in the room. Yeah, pretty standard. Like, dang, none of it was wasted. I'm glad I had all that experience, but I got busy. Over the next 22 years, I tried 14 different things to help people get off of processed foods and stay off of them, and none of them worked, except my doctoral internship, which was a 2-year education program at a small faith organization. Those people picked it up, they spread it around, and they got the benefits. But I went on. I read a popular book. I went back, I got my Ph.D. in addictive nutrition. I published with my team the first description of refined food addiction in the academic press. And I got a doctoral divorce. There is such a thing as a doctoral divorce. And I used my divorce settlement money to start a prepared meal company. And I thought, oh gosh, I'll just give people this nice, clean food, and then they'll feel so great, they'll just do it. It's like, no, that's like giving an alcoholic water. You're just going to feel so much better. And that's not how you recover from a severe addiction. So along in 2014, my dad died and left me an inheritance that I could live on at the same time that CRC Press, which is the biggest textbook company in the world, asked me to write the textbook for processed food addiction. I had 3 years. I went back to where I grew up so that I could be present for my stepmom and advocate for her through the end of her life. Yeah, I wrote that book over 3 years. My stepmom died, and I moved to Seattle to be close to both my daughters are here. And what I discovered from the textbook is this is typically a severe addiction. Starts very young, lots of different substances, heavily promoted, heavily stimulated, very addictive substances. And it's just a perfect explanation for why people know things and can't do them. It's because the knowing part of the brain is weaker than the addicted part of the brain. There's a ton of research on this because researchers have been turning out new science on obesity, eating disorders, and drug addiction. And they don't know that they're describing processed food addiction. Now they know, but that's why that textbook has 2,000 citations. I looked at 6,000 or 8,000 studies over those 3 years, and there's just a ton of evidence. It's a done deal. It exists. It's very well documented. If somebody tries to argue that it doesn't exist, they're just ignoring thousands of demonstrations of the disease. So finally, in January of 2018, I finally, after 22 years of trying lots of different things to get people off of processed foods, I discovered Zoom. And Zoom, as you know, ShawnBaker, your community is here on the screen. It works. It does create community. So that's where we are today, turning out new findings in the field of recovery from these very toxic substances that have been hidden in our food.
Yeah, thank you for that background. Are you currently in Seattle right now? Is that where you're living right
yes,
now?
I live in Seattle. I have family there. I'm actually in Portland at this very second. But I could be anywhere. Yeah.
Okay. Because
We're
I was just saying,
all around the world now. We go from Australia to Africa to Europe to South and North America, and then back to Australia. We're a 24-hour-a-day operation.
Yeah, I was going to say, we just recently moved to Snohomish, which is.
Oh, you're kidding.
We're just, not far from you, so we'll have to meet up at some point. But
yeah,
I wanted to
beautiful.
I wanted to just ask. I mean, because I'm aware, there was this guy, and there's probably many more like him, Moskowitz, who kind of came up with this thing called the bliss point. But what has the food industry? Because what are we up against with the food industry, the processed food industry? What kind of research have they done to make food addictive?
ShawnBaker, I got to tell you, I don't know how many interviews I've done, but you are the first interviewer who ever asked the most important question first. What are those friggin' corporations doing to us? And I thought for years, okay, so I got that great MBA, lovely, I'm not using it, but okay, so I have it. Bingo, it turns out to be the key to everything. I have a weird background, a Ph.D. in addictive nutrition and an MBA and an undergraduate degree in economics and political science. But you need all of those pieces in order to understand what happened to us. Why did we go from, pretty stable, 45% obese and overweight in the 1970s? And why, in this very specific 20-year period, did we go from 45% to over 70%? Again, pretty stable. What happened in the middle is the tobacco industry bought Kraft, Nabisco, General Foods, and then Dannon Yogurt, and they brought with them a very specific business model. It is the addiction business model. And because I've got that addiction background or the business background, I could describe it. I've published on it. I published a chapter in a mentor's book. It's called Focusing the Fight. So you've asked exactly the right question. So the addiction business model is the 5 A's. And you're asking about the very first A, which is addictive product formulation. And they did it for cigarettes. They took nicotine, they extracted it, concentrated it, and put it back into cigarettes. That's addictive product formulation. You are hiding addictive substances in the product until you can get the person to use it enough times that you've hyperactivated the reward centers in the brain. You've addicted those brain cells. So that's number one, addictive product formulation. What happened in the early 1980s is high fructose corn syrup came on the market. And that enabled the second A. And the product has to be affordable. You have to be able to buy it often enough to use it often enough to become addicted to it. And what happened in the early 1980s is high fructose corn syrup came on the market. I know the tobacco industry was looking at this because in 1963, tobacco bought Hawaiian Punch. And they took their cigarette business model and transferred it to sugar for children. How do we know this? Because the tobacco industry was required to submit a lot of, like 40,000 internal documents as part of their settlement. And they're all at the University of California, San Francisco, and those researchers are just going through them methodically. And they found the memo describing how to transfer things like, the Marlboro warehouse where you could get Marlboro logo things. They just transferred that and created a punchy character, the Hawaiian Punchy, and you could get logo toys so that you were constantly being stimulated. So cheap. Suddenly they no longer had to depend on the sugar cartel in Florida for their sweetener, which would have been fatal to the business model if they didn't have control over pricing of their ingredients, but they had high fructose corn syrup. I think that was another big turning point. The third A is advertising. They got in there, you see that the cartoon commercials to children on one Saturday morning go from about 150 to 550 in 7 years. And this is how you maintain and reinforce the addiction. You've now trained these reward center brain cells to hyper release craving chemicals in the brain. And that's what these addictive substances do. Massive flood of addictive neurotransmitters in the brain, which control behavior. And then once you associate those with particular cues or triggers or reminders, messaging, then the cueing alone will create that flood. It's diabolical. So you see this vast increase in advertising, and then the other two are availability. They take out the tobacco vending machines, the cigarette vending machines, and they replace them with snack machines. And the last one is young age. So just like they tried to go after 10-year-olds with the Joe Camel cartoon campaign for cigarettes, now they were able to just get right in there with newborns. They really could do it at conception, because if the parents are eating processed foods, their DNA is replicating in an addictive fashion. So the very first cell of that new baby is already addicted. So there's Howie Moskowitz. He was hired. He's got a Ph.D. in addictive, well, no, it's my Ph.D. His Ph.D. is experimental psychology of marketing from Harvard. And those guys are valuable. Stanford also turns them out. Screen addiction came out of Stanford. Howie Moskowitz is worth $45 million today. He went around to all the corporations. He developed a technique for getting right to the point where you could maximize the sugar, fat, salt in a product and the consumer wouldn't notice. That's the addictive product formulation. And that's what he did. And he went around to all the corporations. He did hundreds of products. Once one corporation did it, then everybody had to do it because they all had to keep up. And I think the most egregious example is pasta sauce, tomato sauce. Before Howie Moskowitz, it didn't have sugar in it. And after Howie Moskowitz, a 1/2 cup serving, which is minuscule, had the same amount of sugar as 2 Oreos. You hit the right question right off the bat. Very impressive.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard not to see that. You know, if you step back far enough, you can see how what you're up against. And you know, you mentioned, you know, from conception and certainly from newborn, if you pick up a bottle of formula or a can of formula, and you look at the ingredient, it's corn syrup is right up there as number 1 or 2 on almost all of these. And so, is that formula? It puzzles me why that's in newborn formula. What role it can serve other than, you know, creating these addicted little kids. I mean, it doesn't seem like it provides any actual nutrition to these children. Why is it in there?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head. The younger you addict any animal, it's not just humans, the harder it will be to break the addiction. And this is something that I just really glommed onto this year. So you have a recovery community. I know you might not think of it that way, but you are. You're providing the most essential defense against these corporations. And here it is. The most powerful part of the brain is the brain that keeps us breathing and our blood pumping, the autonomic system. Right underneath that is mirror neurons. Conformance drive, the drive to fit in, the drive to belong. Why is that so powerful? Well, because for all the millions of years that we were evolving, if you belonged in a tribe of 7 to 12 people, your genes got passed down. You belonged to that tribe because you were copying them, mimicking them, mirroring them. They were going to look for food, you went with them. They were looking for shelter because the weather was coming in, you went with them. They were fighting off a predator, you fought off that predator too. They were looking after your kids, you looked after kids too. So this is in our primitive brain, which is 98% of our brain is pretty much working the way it did a couple million years ago. The only new stuff is this little teeny tiny teensy frontal lobe, 2% of the brain. So the people who didn't conform, who didn't have the drive to belong, they were the ones who were wandering off all the time. They got eaten. They didn't live long enough to pass on their genes. We don't have their genes. We don't have the genes that make us really, really comfortable being off by ourselves. Our brain is just a whole big network of mirror neurons looking around. Who's around? Who's around? What are they doing? How do we copy them? So you have done the most important thing that you can do for a human being on the planet today, which is, Shawn, you've given your people a community to copy. I've done the same thing. So that's what happened January 2018 is I got on Zoom. And finally, after 22 years, I had something that worked. That first day, people who hadn't been able to eat clean for 20 years were eating clean. One day. Dang, I didn't know about mirror neurons, but I sure went and looked. And the research on this is excellent. So the first way to fight the food industry is to disengage from their messaging. So this little teeny tiny frontal lobe cannot win against the addicted brain cells. These addicted brain cells started being addicted at the moment of conception, constant reinforcement for decades through advertising availability, cheap prices, everybody else is eating it. And, but what just took one day of mirror neurons being around people who were eating clean for these people to flip. Got to just get those the mirror neurons are like a radar. And they're either focused on people who are eating processed foods and killing themselves unknowingly, or you can swing them over and get them to latch on to people who are eating healthy, thinking healthy, in healthy relationships, doing healthy things for themselves. Just all the food is like the tail of the dog. You got to make the rest of the dog happy, and then the tail will be happy.
One
I
of
don't
the
know, did that make
things,
any sense?
no, it absolutely does, Joan. But one of the things that seems to be obvious, but I don't know if there's a formal connection, but there, we have a lot of people addicted to these processed foods. Clearly it's causing, you mentioned obesity, but all these other epidemics.
I know, 1 million Americans die from this every 2 years. It's much worse
And then
than
you have
COVID.
the pharmaceutical industry, which is obviously benefiting from this. Is there a direct relationship between it? Do we see this tit for tat sort of thing?
Yep.
Do we have board of directors that share positions on both companies? Or
Oh,
how is that relationship established?
How does that work? So I got this, Rob Lustig published a book this year called Metabolical. And I got this story out of his book, Can't Not Recommend It Enough. He describes the beginning of the medical education system that we have. And my daughter is an MD. She's an MD MBA. We all got our MBAs. And I know why she went into medicine, because she saw this absolute miracle in our household when she was 11 years old. Because I did have a good therapist. She did help me get the processed foods out of the house. She helped me to stop enabling my children. And she told me how to get them to not trigger me. So they just went through the same miracle that we all have been through. Their grades came up, the brain fog went away. They lost a little bit of extra weight. They became very popular. They had these wonderful, cheerful dispositions, and they got to be the captains of their sports teams. They ran for office. It was a little girls' school, and they just practically ran the school. And I went, this was my first attempt. I went to the other mothers. I said, this isn't fair. I'm going to tell them how to do this. And not one of them did it. And because I was banging up against a severe addiction, and without knowing it. I didn't really know what a severe addiction was until I wrote the textbook. I managed to get through a whole PhD program without really understanding what does it mean to have a severe addiction. So it's your question, how do you defend about this, is you get your mirror neurons to land somewhere else. Food industry is incredibly and horribly good at getting your mirror neurons to attach to them. Oh, they're eating that. I see that on TV. Oh, everybody's eating it. Oh, everybody's lined up at the fast food place. Okay, well, I'll line up there too. You know that feeling where your car just drives itself into the fast food lane? That's a conformance drive. Exploited, hijacked, kidnapped. Your conformance drive has been kidnapped by the processed food industry. So yes, absolutely. This is a gold mine. The medical community started, the medical education community started as a way for Rockefeller to sell a byproduct of his petroleum process. So the medical community is a marketing arm of the pharmaceutical industry. Dietitians are a marketing arm of the processed food industry. And yeah, this is why I have a really good PR person, and she does an incredible job of placing articles, getting the attention of reporters. But the other day I was asking about a particular media outlet, and she said, Joan, they just don't think processed food addiction exists. I said, well, dang, there's a textbook on it. I said, they just don't. I don't think she's right. I think they don't want to risk their advertising revenue. But I will tell you, there is one outlet which is stepping up. US News and World Report. I just got my 3rd placement with them. They're publishing a second blog over my name. And one of their mainstream health reporters just did an article on, I forget, I do a lot of this stuff. So US News and World Report, kind of the last place you think. They're starting to, they're on their third article. But any news outlet puts their whole existence on the line if they publish on this. What are the tobacco companies actually doing to us? They got 2/3 of Americans to smoke. They killed millions of people around the world. They don't care. Now they're doing the same thing with processed foods, only it's all the way down to children. So yeah, and it's not just the pharmaceutical industry and the processed food industry, it's also the diet industry, $33 billion a year industry. It's the glamour industry. It's the supplements industry. It's the fitness industry. It's the entertainment industry. It's the sports industry. It's movies. You know, a movie theater owner makes their money off of the concession stand. The movie maker takes the ticket sales. So this is, I estimate, you know, I have an undergraduate degree in economics. I estimate that about half of the US domestic economy depends on this addiction.
That's amazing. That's a fascinating fact. Let me ask you about, because you mentioned, you know, the earlier we get them addicted, the more severe that addiction becomes. What about our school systems?
Oh my God.
Is there some sort of filtration of the school system?
Well, Sean, you are hitting this. So the other incredible thing, now, just go back to the early 1980s, the tobacco companies are finally getting beat up in the courts. They're finally, you know, negotiating these multi-billion-dollar settlements. They need another industry. And of course, we all know that when you stop smoking, you start eating. So I think they were already looking at investments, but then boom, here comes high fructose corn syrup. But the most incredible thing is this very corrupt food pyramid process takes place in the early 1980s. Another Harvard person. This is a hard story to tell, but here we go. Hegsted, I forget his first name, Hegsted. He was a nutrition researcher at Harvard. Harvard's got a big nutrition department. And he was taking money from the sugar industry to write reports that fat caused heart disease. Everybody's worried about heart disease because President Eisenhower was having a lot of heart attacks. And so he published an article along with Ansel Keys, you guys know, saying that fat is the culprit in heart disease. It was protecting the sugar industry. Sugar is the culprit in heart disease. So he gets himself in charge of the food pyramid. And you know that first food pyramid, the whole bottom row is addictive substances. It's all refined carbohydrates. So you can imagine these tobacco executives, not only is the government not prosecuting these processed food manufacturers, they're promoting them. You can just imagine these executives jumping for joy. Oh my goodness, because those were huge investments. They bought Kraft and Nabisco, 80% of Nabisco, and General Foods in 3 years. Something happened, and it was the ability to get to small children, a cheap sweetener, and friggin' advertising from the government for highly addictive substances. Yeah, you're putting the pieces together, Sean. You got this.
Yeah, I didn't realize that the tobacco industry pivoted and bought all these companies. That's something I didn't realize, but it certainly, you know, you can see that a model being promulgated, like you mentioned. So let me just switch gears a little bit.
Yeah.
As we've kind of defined some of the problem, how do we fix it? I mean, how do you deal with a severe processed food addict? I mean, and what are some of the other? I mean, you know, you mentioned high fructose corn syrup, salt, fat. I mean, they put other stuff in the foods too.
Yeah, they sure do. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what they are. Maybe, I mean, I can guess on some of those, but you probably have more thought on that than I do. What else is in the food that's addictive, and how do we get off this stuff?
Okay, so two more excellent questions. There are like 7 major categories. It's another reason why the addiction is so hard to put in remission. For example, if you just have, alcohol addiction, then the dopamine pathway is altered. It's collapsed. It's not working. You're trying to make it work with alcohol, but it's just a dopamine pathway. But with processed foods, there's so many different substances that all 4 of the major reward pathways are collapsed. And you're desperately trying to get one of them to fire and connect with the receptor next to it so that you can feel good again. So it's dopamine and serotonin and opiate and cannabinoid. So they're all collapsed. You see this really terrifying, very slight, not statistically significant yet, very slight increase in the rate of suicide. Well, if all of your feel-good pathways are collapsed, there's nothing good. You can't perceive anything good in your life. So you would expect to see an increase in suicides, and we do it. Of course, we have epidemics of depression and anxiety. Processed foods artificially elevate adrenaline. So you're constantly afraid and angry. Artificial, not related to what's actually going on in your life. It's a chemical imbalance. So sugars of any kind, including artificial sweeteners, any of those are able to hyperactivate the dopamine fields and create a flood of craving neurotransmitters, whether there are calories present or not. There are no calories in heroin, no calories in cocaine. It's not the issue. Flour, it's a refined carbohydrate that gets into the system very quickly. You get a glucose high and a corresponding serotonin high. Gluten has been shown to attach to the opiate receptors in the brain. There's a natural, lovely substance in gluten called gluteomorphine. But the wheat in the United States has an artificially elevated high level of gluten, and now a lot of people are addicted to it. Excessive salt is associated with activating the opiate receptors. Dairy is a substance designed to put a 100-pound calf to sleep. It's narcotic. It's a little baby calf narcotic. It has 4 different casomorphines in it, plus a sugar, lactose, plus a little bit of salt, and of course, fat. So it's a it's kind of like a poly substance use play there. And if you take the fat out, which does slow down absorption, then boom, you've got a highly addictive substance called skim products. And then you've got processed fats, which activate the same pathway as marijuana. And then you've got caffeine. And then you've got all the hidden additives. Like there are 15,000 additives that the processed food industry uses. It's a mess. So I love Marion Nestle. Marion Nestle's the past chair of the nutrition department at New York University. She says, if it has a label on it, it's a warning label. Yeah, this is a very severe addiction.
I can definitely say. So I've got an interesting observation, and perhaps you can help me out with this. But I see a lot of people that come on this sort of animal-based diet. They get rid of all the processed food, and they no longer crave cigarettes. They no longer crave alcohol. What is going on in that situation? Why is that the case? And why do not? And this is the other, I guess, a follow-up question on that. When you look at people that go into rehab, drug rehab, alcohol rehab, it's often the diet that they're put on is continued junk. And why aren't they marrying those two things if that actually helps it?
Okay, you are just pumping them out, Sean. These are 2 really good questions. So your first question a couple of questions ago was, what do we do about it? You reprogram those reward center cells not to erupt. And one of the ways you do that is you get the substances out. So what is the first thing you want to do with an alcoholic? You want to get the alcohol out. So that does happen when you go on a carnivore food plan. If you go on one that doesn't have addictive substances on it, like I've seen carnivore food plans that have addictive substances on them, the alcohol and the dairy. So, but if you go on one that doesn't have those addictive substances, then you're depriving the addicted brain cells of stimulation. You are sending the blood flow to other parts of the brain. It's just like if you want to pump up a muscle, you focus on that muscle, you do exercises. I want a bicep, then I'm going to do bicep curls. I want a frontal lobe, well, then I'm going to do things that stimulate the frontal lobe. I want to stop having an addiction, well, I'm going to stop doing things that stimulate the addiction. The blood flow goes to a different part of the brain. The hyperactive brain cells are deprived of nourishment and they settle down and they stop running your brain. So whether it's alcohol or cigarettes or any addictive substance, gambling, sex addiction, shopping addiction, relationship addiction, if your addicted brain cells are settled down, they're not pumping out floods of craving neurotransmitters, then they no longer run your brain. You can then get your mirror neurons to switch over, latch onto people who are eating clean, and that's the key. But in order to get those mirror neurons to latch over, you have to spend a lot of time. I mean, in our community, we offer 15 hours a day of live programming on Zoom, and then we have a huge archive of videos that people can play between the live events. So you can get mirror neurons to switch over pretty darn quick if you can immerse. There's the key word, immersion. If you can just dominate all the messaging coming into that brain with clean eating, this is why, this is the science, clean thinking. This is because stress is another trigger. This is why all television programming is stressful. So that's how that works, is you immerse yourself in clean messaging. So this little tiny frontal lobe, it's never going to win against the addicted brain cells. Mirror neurons can switch you over. But what this frontal lobe can do, and this is the key to everything, the frontal lobe can control the messaging that reaches the other 98% of the brain. The other 98% of the brain is helplessly taking in whatever messages come its way, putting them in the filing cabinets of the brain, and then referring to them for direction on what to do. So the frontal lobe will always lose against the addicted brain cells. The frontal lobe, however, can control the messaging that reaches the addicted brain cells and thereby put the addiction into remission.
Yeah, I want to just, there's a question coming in the chat, and I want to, one of our members is actually doing a study looking at food addiction at the University of Scranton. And so he's getting data from our members on this stuff, but he's asking if you could expand a little bit more upon how the endocannabinoid system is working with food. How does that work? Because it's, we're told about, CBD and THC and all that stuff is being used as a treatment tool, but how does processed food impact that? If you can expand upon that a little.
So if you give me a second, I'll remember the researcher's name. It's not I'll remember, or if you email me at info@processed food addiction, I can give you there was one researcher who's just really specialized in the cannabinoid system, and yeah, I can't think of his name. So there is a chapter in the textbook, processed food addiction textbook, chapter 6 on food plans. And it will give you the, so I finished work on the manuscript in 2017. So it's already 4 years out of date. I do keep up the research. I'll publish, I will create a paper. I probably will not get it published in the academic press, but maybe my publicity person will be able to place it. But you can certainly write to me and ask me for it, which I will make a list of the top 10 studies in processed food addiction for 2021. The research is just exponentially increasing. So this guy, if I can remember his name, did the research showing that fats activate the same pathway as cannabis. So, Shawn, actually, this goes back to another question you asked, which is, sure enough, you go for a 28-day alcoholism treatment program. Do they treat the addiction? No. It just got this year. I mean, this is such a huge thing that I'm just developing these insights still. I've been in the field now for almost 26 years. Nobody is treating addictions out there, except maybe you and me, Shawn. They're all transferring the addiction. They're all transferring the addiction from whatever addictive substances the person came in on to processed foods. So one of the greatest studies is by Mark Gold, who's the past president of the American Association of Addiction Medicine and the head of the McKnight Brain Institute at the University of Florida. And he published research. He noticed that his morphine addicted people who were in treatment, who were coming off of morphine, they'd sit down at the table and open the cap of the salt shaker and pour salt on their food. So he got, oh, well, salt is doing something that takes the place of morphine. And it's a really important study. So yeah, they're just transferring it. So whenever you go to one of these facilities, it's very easy to imagine that the staff has also gone through this process of transferring the addiction to processed foods. They're not in the least bit interested in having anybody pry into their new addiction. It's legal, it's acceptable, everybody else is doing it, nobody's hassling them about it. They can go to work, they can have a job, there are no legal problems. And they just transferred their addiction to a safer, what looks like a safer set of substances, addictive substances. So they're not really interested. And plus, if you really take people off of substances, all of them, you don't transfer them over to processed foods, it's painful, it's hard. They get a headache. You guys call it keto flu. We call it withdrawal from addictive processed foods. They're harder to manage. It's much easier to just, if they're in a facility, just transfer them over to caffeine and sugar.
Yeah, that's, a couple of things, you mentioned that morphine doesn't have calories. I think that's great. And then talking about instead of treating addiction, you're transferring it. Those are really important concepts, I think. There's somebody asking about, does fasting have a role in any of this? And I guess if you're fasting, you're not eating anything. Well, I guess the more important question for me is, you got to eat something, right? We have to eat. And so, there's a biological need for us to eat. And then there's sort of things that, can we find things that we can eat? And, I would argue that meat is a pretty good, at least one source of food you can eat pretty decently without major problems. But what is a diet of a non-addicted person supposed to?
So I'm really glad you asked that question. I'm taking a course right now. All my background is in addiction. But I am branching out. I'm taking a course from the Nutrition Network right now, the Metabolic Health Practitioners Certification. And I just listened to a lecture by Megan Ramos. She just says it. She comes straight out and says it. She says people with a history of addiction should not be fasting. So before anybody fasts, they can go to our website, processedfoodaddiction.com, and they can take the self-quiz for the 11 signs of addiction to processed foods. And if you get any of those, you should not be fasting. Now, I say that, but let me also say this. I learned about level 1 fasting, which is don't eat between meals. You eat 3 full meals a day and don't eat between meals. I'm all over that. I can front to back to center to inside, outside recommend level 1 fasting for anybody all time. Why? Because you're cutting back on the cueing. Lapsing starts with a cue, some kind of reminder, message, trigger, stimulation. So if you train your body that food is only going to be available 3 times a day, it will not bug you. It will not ask for food between meals. It's got to be very reliable. We're going to eat at this time, so don't worry about whether there's going to be food. The calmness that comes over a body, over a brain, when you hit those meals, fully portioned meals on time, every day, your body it's a beautiful, beautiful feeling, because your body is now not putting thoughts about food in your head between meals. It says, okay, I know when it's coming. We got enough food. There's another part of the brain I haven't talked about, which is the food-seeking brain. And the food-seeking brain wakes up when there's not enough food. The leading cause of death for humans for all time on the planet is famine, starving to death. So when we don't eat enough food, if you don't eat enough food enough of the time, not only do you have the addicted brain, not only do you have loss of your frontal lobe because the blood flow is going to the addicted brain, but now you have a third factor, which is you've woken up the fear of famine brain. And I say that mirror neurons are the second strongest system in the brain, with one exception. And that is if the fear of famine brain has woken up. If the food-seeking brain has woken up, it is stronger than the mirror neuron system. And how do you know this? This is really interesting. So if there's a famine going on, your survival strategy is no longer stick with your tribe. Because if you find food, you do not want to share it with anybody. You want to eat it all. You want to eat it really fast before anybody else finds you, or before a predator finds you. You want to eat it really fast, and then you want to get out of there, because whoever is converging on you is converging on that spot. So you want to move. You want to run away, and you want to hide. That is a perfect description of binge eating disorder. So that's not binge eating disorder. That's you've dieted enough or fasted enough, not consistently with an addicted brain, and you've woken up the food-seeking brain.
You mentioned 11. You said you had 11 indicators that you're dealing with food addiction. What are some of the more common ones that you?
All right, let's do this. This is my favorite thing. If I can share this with you, and you guys can get it deep on the inside, that you did not cause this. You are not at fault. Don't blame yourselves. If you realize the tobacco industry came in and gave you this horrible, horrible disease that everybody's now profiting from obscenely, if you can let go of the self-blame, you have a much better chance of getting control of your food, because self-blame is stressful and that activates the addiction. So here, let's do this. Number one, unintended use. You're not going to stop for fast food on the way home and you stop. You're going to eat one, but you eat the box. You wake up, I'm going to eat clean today, and by 10 o'clock, you're at the snack machine. That's unintended use. Number two, failure to cut back. So we know that over 70% of Americans who are overweight or obese, they've certainly tried. A third of the country is dieting at any point, and they failed. Number three, time spent. You know, you're going to get the stuff. You're thinking about this stuff. What am I going to get? And you're back and forth to the break room. You go home, but you leave the house to go get fast food. You're trying to watch TV, but you're walking back and forth to the kitchen. And then you eat enough of it and you've got to go sleep it off. Or you're going to the doctor's office to treat the consequences. And you're too tired. So it's just literally eating up your life. You're spending more and more time on it. Number four, cravings. So if you're thinking about food between meals, you have cravings. If you're not, if you've eaten a meal and you're thinking about food 20 minutes later, you have cravings. If you have a fight with somebody and all you can think about is going to go eat something, those are cravings that have been triggered by stress. So the thing that happens over time is the addicted brain cells become so sensitive that almost anything, they've associated processed foods and the addictive substances with every place, every person in your life, and you're just constantly being triggered. Number five, failure to fulfill roles. You're too brain fogged, you're too tired, your body shape is a barrier, and you can no longer pursue an education, go after career advancement, apply for promotions, get a different job. You can't get down on the floor with your kids. Failure to fulfill roles. Next one is relationship problems. Again, you're really too tired, too craving to connect with another person. Maybe that other person wants you to quit eating the stuff and you can't. So relationship problems. And then activity is given up. The addiction is gradually taking over your life. You don't want to go anywhere anymore, especially this addiction, which has such a profound impact on body shape. I don't want to go. I don't want to see those people. They probably don't like me. And I'm not going to be able to focus on them anyway. I might lose control over food if I go there. I'm not going. I'm too tired. Yeah, plus I'd rather go home and I eat the stuff that I stashed in the laundry room. And then you get hazardous use. So normally you think hazardous use, drunk driving. Well, we are driving with our elbow while we're putting in the fast food. And then use in spite of knowledge of consequences. So that's one of the top 6. Everybody does this. I know I shouldn't, but my doctor told me not to, but. And then there's 1,000 rationalizations, but use in spite of knowledge of consequences. And then there's tolerance. You're eating more of the same stuff. Why? Because your feel-good pathways are in the process of collapsing and you're trying to stimulate them. So it takes more and more stuff over time. You're eating it more often. You used to stop for fast food once a week. Now it's every day. Now it's 3 times a day. You used to stop for coffee on the way to work, and now you're getting it in the middle of the afternoon. You used to buy this size container, but now you're buying that size container. You used to buy 1, now you're buying 2. You used to have it in the evening, now you have it morning, noon, and night. It creeps up, but you're eating more of something. And then number 11 is withdrawal. And how do you know? It's because you're eating for a reason other than hunger. You're eating because you're anxious, because you're craving, because you're tired. That's all drug use. eating for hunger is eating. You just got to divide the whole world of food into two. Processed foods are absorbed by the body like drugs. They have natural endorphins in them, and when you concentrate them, they become a drug according to your body. Food is food. Food looks like it's still looked at the moment of harvest. Once you get that distinction, like nobody says, oh, well, I have to keep drinking alcohol because I need fluids. Nobody says that. Same thing with food. Processed foods.
Yeah, Joan, thank you so much. I unfortunately have only got an hour allotted for this. I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to. Would you be willing to do a follow-up sometime down the road? I mean, because there's so many things, and I think you've got so much great knowledge. That would be really, I think everybody would really appreciate it if you'd be willing to do that.
Yeah,
So.
I'd be happy to come back. Would it be okay if I mentioned our Facebook group?
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you to share where people can find more about you, but certainly I know, unfortunately, didn't get to ask all the questions that people were wanting to ask, but anyway.
Just go to processedfoodaddiction.com. Just go to processedfoodaddiction.com. It's a big old website and you'll get everything you need. Sign up for the free information and you'll start to get our emails. Shawn, I gotta stop before we go. I don't know how you got this, but you really got this.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it becomes obvious once you start looking at this stuff. I mean, it's so many people are sort of under the spell and they can't see through it. But I think once you kind of step away and you see the big picture, it becomes clear.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very, very much. This has been very fascinating and very informative and enlightening.
Thank you.
And thanks for what you're doing. And I look forward to talking to you again. So anyway, thanks, Joan.
Thanks, Shawn. Take care. Thanks for inviting me.
I'll see you guys tomorrow. Otherwise, if I don't see you guys enjoy your
Seattle.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
I can't believe you're there.
Bye, guys. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Join Revero.health for a 30-day free trial to get access to live Q&A with VIP guests, social community meetings, member discounts, low-carb healthcare providers list, forum, workouts, monthly challenges, early access to podcasts, recipes, carnivore diet guide, fasting guide, shred guide, and much more.